Welcome from the National Foreign Language Center at the University of Maryland and all my colleagues at Pearl, a language resource center, to the second day of the Virtual Summit. I actually did remember to unmute myself today, so I think we're off to a even better start than we were yesterday. Thanks for joining us. We now have over 800 participants from 48 states and almost 40 countries who have registered for this summit. And we had such a fantastic day yesterday during the live sessions, the pre-record sessions. A new batch of pre-record sessions launched this morning. And of course, we have a packed schedule of live events again this morning for you to experience. Starting off with our featured speaker in just a moment. There'll be a live presentation on a brand new tool from the TEL project called Learner Pathways. At noon Eastern, Laura Terrell will give a live presentation on trying to answer the question, why does using a target language even matter? We have another live podcast recording, this time from World Language Classroom, who is interviewing Benjamin Tinsley and trying to discuss the topic of equitable feedback and grading practices. And then Laura Terrell and I will wrap up the day at 2 o'clock Eastern in the afternoon to kind of discuss and reflect on some of the themes that we heard throughout the first, the 2 days of the summit. I want to remind everybody that all of the pre-record sessions, which are available now on the summit website as well as on the YouTube channel, have a note-taking, a collaborative processing guide, collaborative note-taking tool so that you can share and expand your thinking along with other participants and attendees of the summit. So don't just take your own notes, but perhaps share your aha moments with somebody else. What are you going to take from this session? And maybe you have resources that actually align with what the presenter is talking about, but take it a step further. This allows us to expand the impact of the sessions infinitely. But now I don't want to take any more time away and instead bring in our morning's featured speaker, Florencia Henshaw. Good morning, Florencia.
Good morning. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to see all the comments. I can't respond to you, but I'm loving it. Okay, so are we ready to go? I think we're ready. Okay. Okay, so welcome everyone. As you know, the topic of my talk is on feedback, and I only have 30 minutes, so there's a lot to unpack. We are going to focusing mainly on language-related comments. So I'm not talking about comments such as, for example, the organization of a paragraph. I am focusing on teacher-provided feedback. I'm not going to be focusing on self-assessment or peer feedback. And I'm focusing on production, right? So you can definitely give feedback on their interpretive language skills, but for this talk, I'm focusing on production. And the goals of my talk are not to give you a set of directives or a magic formula for giving feedback. I'm also not here to tell you what you're doing right or what you're doing wrong. My purpose is to offer perspectives, hopefully so that you can leave some feeling empowered on the decisions that you're making, maybe inspired too, and definitely it's for reflection. You'll see that throughout the presentation, I have a lot of questions, and that is on purpose, right? So that you find the answers that work for your context. And indeed, teaching is communication. It does depend on the context. How you go about it is going to depend on your students, your audience, the context in terms of your conditions, constraints, situations, expectations that go beyond yourself, and your purpose. The purpose for your courses may be different than the purpose for my courses. And feedback is definitely communication. How we go about providing feedback needs to make sense for our audience, our context, and our purpose. When I say audience, I'm thinking of the students, right? If it's teacher-provided feedback, the feedback is for them. It's not for us to make us feel better. It's for them, hopefully, to find it useful and to foster attainable growth. One thing that everybody agrees, even those probably that are not very much pro feedback, is that it has to be at the right level, right? So if the feedback is way above their level, we already know that's not going to be very effective. And I personally think it is very, very important to consider the affective side of feedback. It's not just the cognitive aspect of feedback, but also the affective part of it. You need to consider the impact of your feedback, not just the intent of your feedback. You may have the best intentions in the world and give them lots of suggestions, but will students see it as never stop learning, or will students see it as never good enough? And so in that case, are we fostering growth, or are we growing frustration? So we need to think about how the student is going to perceive the feedback too. In terms of context, you need to consider what factors affect when you provide feedback, how you provide feedback, or how much feedback you can provide. And that is going to be very different for not only each of us, but even within each course that we teach, right? The context change. Even the assignment itself is a context. And another important thing is to think about how the way you're providing feedback fits in with the big picture, with your general pedagogical priorities. So if we say that your priorities, my priorities, are things like proficiency over perfection, meaning making over mastering, creativity over conformity, then does it make sense? Does it fit to then give very detailed feedback on form, as in I'm aiming for perfection? Then there is a little bit of mixed messages, right? A little bit of a contradiction that we need to keep in mind. How does it fit in with the big picture? And of course, purpose or purposes. And the title of my talk, I put purpose right there because I think it is so important. And there's so much to unpack when it comes to the purpose of our feedback. Why are we providing feedback? Many times we talk about feedback, we jump into the how, right? How should I? Let's go back a couple steps. Why? Why are we providing feedback? Is it because you feel it's expected of your role? Maybe it's expected in your job. Maybe you feel it's part of your role as an educator to provide feedback. Is it because we believe that it's necessary for growth? And there's two words I want to unpack there. The necessary means that growth cannot happen without feedback. And I would challenge that, right? So I think that growth is possible even in the absence of feedback. And then that word growth. What are we picturing? What is growth? What effects do we expect feedback to have? We need to have an honest conversation with ourselves and answering that question. What would you consider evidence of effectiveness? Let's not go with whatever the SLA studies tell you that is effective or not. What do you consider evidence of effectiveness? And perhaps frustratingly so, effectiveness is variable. It is not predictable. Doing X doesn't always lead to Y. I think that's probably true for most teaching. I can tell you for language development, this is absolutely true, right? That effectiveness is variable. What works in some cases doesn't work in other cases. So doing X does not always lead to Y. So providing feedback will not always lead to greater accuracy. And it's relative. Effectiveness depends on many factors, right? It is not absolute. It's not that 100% work or 0%. It is very much relative, and it's going to depend on our audience, our context, and our purpose. So the takeaway message when it comes to feedback that everybody can probably agree on is curb your expectations. It is frustrating. I get it. And if you came here for me to give you a set of rules on feedback, I'm sorry, I don't have that because it is extremely, extremely variable. Why? Because the audience is not homogeneous. Students are not all the same. And to provide feedback at the right level for each and every student is close to impossible. The context is not always the same. Assignments change. Sometimes it's spontaneous, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you give lots of scaffolding, sometimes not. Sometimes you have time constraints, sometimes you don't, right? Clarity of purpose may vary. You may be giving feedback that is for them to consider in the long run, or sometimes you may be giving feedback that they need to apply by tomorrow. So that the variability in the applicability of the feedback, the purpose of the feedback, also affects your expectations. So to sum it up, for me, 3 qualities of feedback have to be accessible, actionable, and attainable. So it needs to be clear to the students, right? Our audience. We need to keep our audience in mind. It has to be understood by the students. It has to have a concrete purpose. It needs to be clear what we want them to do with it. And it has to be attainable, right? We want them to be able to do something that they can do, right? Realistic expectations in the given context. Another important quality of feedback comes from the work of Dornier, and he distinguished between informational and controlling feedback. Informational feedback comments on competence, including praise, and I love this phrase, attributes success to effort. So it makes that link, right? And values effort, praises success due to effort. On the other hand, controlling feedback judges performance against external standards. And so in many aspects of my professional life, I've been reflecting on this. To what extent, even when I'm a mentor, when I'm a supervisor, to what extent is my feedback informational versus controlling? So keeping that in mind, let's unpack these 3 common feedback practices, and I'll go one by one. So the first one is detailed form-focused feedback, right? So where the teacher marks and then corrects language errors, right? Sometimes with direct corrections and sometimes with a little explanation. So if we do this, right, we have to ask ourselves, is it actionable? Well, it depends, right? So if you're just providing the corrections and all they do is look at it and that's it is not entirely actionable. Well, we need to tweak it to make it more actionable. The big questions are we fostering attainable growth or are we aiming for perfection, right? Where do we draw the line there? And the big question, are we prioritizing how over what? If this is all the comments they get, then that's a little bit of the message we're sending, right? That how they said it is more important than what they said. Now, I'm not going to get into it. I only have 15 minutes left. I cannot get into a detailed discussion on the error correction debate, especially on writing. So go and check out chapters 5 and 6 of Common Ground, especially chapter 5 talks about the written error correction debate. Let's unpack the second common feedback practices. And this is general comments on performance. Things like try not to hesitate so much, connect your ideas, use longer sentences. So the question is, how actionable is it? It might be clear to the students. It might be accessible. They understand, right? But how actionable is it? We can question that, right? How easy is it for me to control how much I'm hesitating? How easy is it for me to control whether I use longer sentences or shorter sentences, especially if it's something like speaking performance, right? And the big question, going back to what Dornier said, are we perhaps too focused on external standards? And then we have to question what external standards we are espousing, right? Could some of those external standards reflect perhaps some cultural biases? Something we need to reflect, right, on what we're expecting. Now, let's go back to purposes, right? If you're preparing them for a specific performance, such as doing well on the Apple, on STAMP, on the AP exam, that's different because now you have to also take into account your purpose, which is to prepare them for this specific performance. So I could see why you would want to give comments like this. Remember, we're not evaluating this as this is all right or this is all wrong. We're reflecting on our practices. And the third one, I guess it could be like a combo of 1 and 2, which you're focusing on form, but giving general comments as opposed to marking every error. And these are things like just simply telling the student, I liked it very much. Careful with gender agreement, right? Or careful with plural and singular. Now, the 3 qualities that we outline, we have to think about whether they apply to this type of feedback. Is it accessible? Gender agreement for many students may not mean a whole lot, right? And even if you did talk about gender agreement in class a lot, Are they making the connection to what they actually wrote, to their actual production, right? Can they make that cognitive comparison, as it is called? And then, is it actionable? Okay, I'll be careful with gender agreement, but how much is that something that they can control? We need to ask ourselves that. And then, is it attainable? Well, if this is a novice level learner Spanish gender agreement, we know that is going to take a long time to get there. So I wouldn't say that this is attainable growth. I think we're aiming a little bit too high. Now, my take, what I would propose perhaps as the fourth possibility, is what I called feedback and forth. And the back and forth is to emphasize the view of feedback as interpersonal communication. I said earlier that feedback is communication. Let's emphasize that interpersonal part, right? That there's more than one person here. And what I mean by that is, when you're interacting with students in the classroom, you do a lot of this already, right? The feedback is interpersonal. So what if we apply that to other forms of feedback? For example, if a student wrote, tiene un hermano, has a brother, but they were trying to say, I have a brother, should have been tengo. What if we ask a clarification request, right? Here you say that someone has a brother. Who has a brother? The student has to do something. It is actionable. We're asking it in a way that they understand. Perhaps you can underline the verb if you want to help them notice it even more, right? But how can we do it as interpersonal communication? And another example, this is with prompting elaboration. I'd love to know more. ¿Qué te gusta hacer con tu hermano? What do you like to do with your brother? And then you give them a little input in case they need it. A mí me gusta ver la televisión con mi hermano. So if they're novice level learners and they need that modeling, they need that, repetition, they're just going to copy some phrases, and that's okay. That's what novice learners do. You give it to them within the feedback itself. So at the end of the day, I want to go back to audience, context, and purpose. That was my take on it. It may or may not work for your audience. It may or may not work for your context, and it may or may not work for your purpose. So you know your audience, your context, and your purpose better than anybody. And so you need to make the decisions regarding feedback that work for your audience, your context, and your purpose. And I would like to close with this quote by Dornier, who we lost earlier this year. And at least if we can agree on this quote, then I'm happy. And it says, use motivating feedback by making your feedback informational rather than controlling, giving positive competence feedback, pointing out the value of accomplishment, and not overreacting to errors. So thank you very much. I am eager to read your comments and your questions. We have 10 minutes and I love interaction. So hopefully you have some positive feedback, motivational feedback for me. Let's see if I can see some comments. I see a lot of comments. I see a question by Meredith. Thank you. What is the question you get asked about feedback the most, would you say? Oh, probably number one is it worth it to correct errors? Should I keep correcting my students' errors in writing? That is definitely the number one question. And my answer is exasperating, right? It goes back to, what are you trying to do? What is your purpose? What evidence of effectiveness would you accept, right? What are you looking for this feedback to do? And so if part of that response is, oh, I want the errors to go away, then we have to have a conversation on curbing your expectations, because unfortunately it doesn't work X leads to Y every time. And simply correcting errors, it just does not magically improve accuracy. Okay, I see lots of other comments. I'm trying to keep up, sorry. Let's see. Oh, hang on, there we go. Thank you so much for the great suggestions. Could you provide some suggestions on peer feedback? Oh, yeah, I mean, that is another big topic to unpack. The first thing is to train the students, right? To have them understand what the purpose of the peer feedback is, to provide a lot of guidance in terms of what type of comments to make. As much as possible, I'd like to take into consideration who they would like to work with. And you can do that in a survey response that only you can see. And many students say, I can work with anybody, no problem. And some of them do have preferences, and I respect those preferences because it has to be a good environment for peer feedback to happen. So if they're resistant to working with somebody from the outset, it's going to be very difficult for the peer feedback to be effective. Are there more questions? I'm sorry, about peer feedback. Oh, TJ, hey, making feedback interpersonal. Could you give an example of how you have learners interact with your feedback? So for me, if I'm going to be giving feedback, I'm expecting them to revise and resubmit, as we do in academic publishing, right? Like there's got to be something that they need to do with it. If I know that I am not going to have that built into the assignment, that the student is just going to take the paper and take it home and I'll never hear from it again, then it's no longer interpersonal, right? So I have to make sure that I build it in so that if I make those little comments with a clarification request or with expansion or elaboration, that they're going to work on it and submit it again, right? There's got to be that built in within the assignment, because otherwise it's like comment on somebody's forum post and then that person never sees it, right? What is the point of that? I wonder. Don't get me started on forum posts. What else we have? So, I mean, I don't know, TJ, if that really answered your question. I answered very quickly because I'm trying to be mindful of time, but I have something coming up in the Language Educator, hopefully if they accept it for publication, on one way in which you can build in back and resubmit, going back and resubmit. How can we do that within the assignment itself so that feedback becomes very purposeful, very concrete? Okay. What would you recommend when a student work with other tutors? Okay. And I think to provide feedback. Yes. We noticed it. Absolutely. Ooh, what a fantastic question. This happens. So I guess it depends on your context. Do you have any kind of contact with this tutor or not? I think that's the first question that I would need to ask. In our case, for example, we have a tutoring room, right, where the students can go get help, and we definitely know who the tutors are, and therefore we can provide some kind of training to the tutors and help them understand what kind of feedback they can or should not provide. If you really cannot, what I would probably say is to have a conversation with your student, right? Like that's the best among all the participants in that particular situation. If you only have access to your student, then talk to the student and help them understand. Maybe give them some tips on ways that they can approach their tutor, or at the very least, empower the student to be able to know more than the tutor and be like, okay, I understand you're correcting me, but I am novice high, I am intermediate, so I'll do it at my pace, kind of thing, you know? So I think that maybe you should empower the student. But if you can talk to the tutor, definitely talk to the tutor and just help them, not admonishment, but more in terms of, you know, we need to work together here, right? Because we want the student to succeed, focus on the common goal. Explain to them that simply correcting errors and aiming too high is doing the opposite. And I cannot imagine a tutor being resistant to learning and saying, okay, you're right, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. Again, intent versus impact. And you go from there. Okay, let's see what we have. Collegial feedback, Jeanette. Oh my God, yes. I want to write something about that, right? So giving feedback and accepting feedback on our practices and on our teaching. Yes, I love that. Let's do that. Right now in 4 minutes is going to be difficult, but yeah, I think it's part of that, the whole informational versus controlling has to do with that. The whole idea of taking into account context, audience, and purpose, very much related to that. And many times we rush to give advice to each other, or we rush to judge each other on how we teach without a full understanding of audience, context, and purpose. So that is definitely relevant too. Marta made a comment about heritage language students. Yes, absolutely, right? That they need to fix their errors, and that's what learning means. So I would be even more careful providing this kind of controlling, form-focused, detailed feedback on heritage students' production. Yes. Oh, that's a good question. Michael asked, how do you determine whether to reteach instead of giving individual feedback? That is a good question, Michael. And I'm sorry, I'm going to be exasperating once again and have to ask, right? I need to understand the whole thing, right? I need to understand the big picture. Now, when you say reteach, the way that I interpret that, but it could be that that's just my own experience, as reteach means explaining language again. And I would not explain language a lot to begin with. And so I need to understand the full context. Now, individual feedback, I think, is good. I'm not sure that I would just go with one or the other, or one instead of the other. I think that giving feedback that is actionable, that students need to do something with, and also reflecting on, do I need to give them more input on this? Do I need to do more activities on that, right? So also reflecting on how it affects your teaching. I think both of them are good. Okay, I think my time is up. I'm getting kicked out. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for your wonderful questions. I know we are all out of time.
We wouldn't kick you out, but I want to thank you for giving so much food for thought. Obviously, the conversations are going fast and furious, and perhaps we can continue them on Twitter or some other venue when we meet again. But thank you so very much for sharing your thoughts and your time with us this morning. Yeah, it was great.